Okay, again, this is Jenny Nielsen with Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items for the session. You'll notice that all lines, except for those of our speakers, are muted. This is to prevent any interruptions and distractions. You're welcome to use the Q&A box to enter questions at any time throughout the session. We will have a Q&A session at the end, but we're happy to take questions throughout and address them as we can moving through the presentation. If we don't get to all the questions, we'll be happy to follow up following the webinar. And I also wanted to note that the webinar is being recorded, so it will be available for distribution on our websites after the call. Joining us on the webinar today are Kurt Bauman, Executive Director of Northeastern Pennsylvania Grantmakers, Davis Parchment, Manager of Knowledge Services at the Foundation Center, Sydney Hargo, Executive Director of Philanthropy Network Greater Philadelphia, and Barbara Taylor, Executive Director of Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania. I'm going to first turn things over to Kurt Bauman, Executive Director of Northeastern Pennsylvania Grantmakers, who's going to provide some background for us about the Pennsylvania Stats Dashboard before we dive into a demo and discussion. And Kurt, you are unmuted. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jenny mentioned, I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director for the Northeastern Pennsylvania Nonprofit and Community Assistance Center. And I also have the pleasure of leading the Northeastern Pennsylvania Grantmakers Forum. I'm honored and humbled to represent our partnership today and welcome you to today's program. As noted, today's webinar is designed to introduce nonprofit stakeholders from across the Commonwealth to a new tool known as the Pennsylvania Foundation Stats. The tool is formed in partnership between 3 philanthropy-serving organizations, including within Pennsylvania, including the Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania, the Northeastern Pennsylvania Grantmakers, and Philanthropy Network Greater Philadelphia. The program was designed to better track and understand grant-making trends within our regions and across the state. It provides transparency to grant makers and to nonprofits seeking funding, and it also helps us understand and look at grants that are coming into the state and better track to see how well we're doing overall in importing funding from foundations out of state. Pennsylvania Foundation Stats is a new dashboard. We'll use the terms tool and dashboard interchangeably, and it provides a window into the philanthropic landscape for our state and includes 4 distinct regions. The dashboard is made possible through a national partnership with the Foundation Center, headquartered in New York, and represents a groundbreaking collaboration amongst the 3 partners I mentioned. So this is the first time we're partnering on something like this as a group, and it's a great statewide collaboration. Pennsylvania is one among the first states to pilot the new tool. We're proud to join other states, including California, Connecticut, Illinois, Indiana, and the Southeast Council of Foundation, which represents 11 states across the southeast U.S. Now we'd like to have Davis from the Foundation Center walk us through the tool and the amenities within the portal. Davis?
Great. Thank you so much, Kurt, for that introduction. This is Davis Parchment. I am a Knowledge Service Manager over at the Foundation Center and have been the lead in the Get on the Map campaign, as well as the work with this wonderful group of funders, collaboratives, to bring you the Pennsylvania Foundation Stats, aka dashboard, aka tool. So I want to kind of walk you into this demo with a broader context so that you understand why this is such an important transition that we're making into kind of near real-time data for our sector, and kind of how we got here. And I think it's important both in terms of how you understand the dashboard as well as your own understanding of how you can participate in making things better. And I guess the best place to start is a little bit of history about the Foundation Center and our role within the sector a little bit of our history and our journey in bringing the data that's going to go into informing this tool that you will all hopefully use on a regular basis. So our mission has pretty much since 1956 been to strengthen the social sector by advancing knowledge about philanthropy in the U.S. primarily, but also around the world more recently. And our history goes back to 1956 when we were actually formed by some of the first foundations, ironically in response to the Red Scare, where the Cox Committee actually called foundations to the Hill to explain where their monies were going and whether they were going to support un-American activities. And one of our founders, Russell Leffingwell, who was the chair of the board of the Carnegie Corporation at the time, stood before the Cox Committee and said, you know what, we think foundations need to have glass pockets. That is, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to build this organization called the Foundation Center. I don't think he gave that in his official testimony. His testimony is just the quote, but coming out of that meeting, there was a movement to create a window of transparency in the philanthropic sector and to organize and structure the information about who's doing what, where in the philanthropic field. Because as many of you know, this is a very disparate set of organizations. Currently, right now, we have over 86,000 foundations that represent more than $62 billion in giving. This is just in the U.S. And almost $900 billion in assets. So this is a large, formidable sector, but it's also incredibly disparate. And really, there's no glue that binds these organizations because they're all independent by design, except for one thing, which is that they are to be transparent and open to in terms of what they're doing with their resources. And so the traditional form of how we have shared information about philanthropy for the last 56 years has been turning to these IRS tax documents that everyone is required to fill out that have 15 sections of information, anywhere from your name, your address, your balance sheets, a whole slew of questions about whether you're not participating in political activity and if anybody benefited personally from this organization's wealth, as well as your top 5 paid staff, your top 5 paid consultants, your programs, and in the back for the 990 PFs for private foundations, there's a detailed listing of the grants. And so the Foundation Center made, I would say, more of an art than a science for a long time of going to the regional IRS tax offices and literally having librarians that would go in and transcribe from these archaic documents information about all the foundations so that we could centralize that information and make it available. And originally it was sort of publishing like head counts of numbers of foundations and total giving and assets and general giving patterns. And then over the years, the IRS evolved and the Foundation Center evolved, and we started receiving CD-ROM batches of data from the IRS, which would contain like thousands and thousands of pages of image files. And so then our team would have to take off of these tax return forms, using an extraction tool information, and mind you, those forms often are handwritten because I don't think any foundation ever, I don't think any foundation, I think most foundations don't realize that this tax return becomes sort of the record of the foundation and that that's the most publicly available and reliable source of information about them, and that ends up becoming sort of what we use for data and for research for the field. And so they fill out those sometimes in handwritten form. A lot of times it's just an accountant filling it out, and that information then we would extract that and load it into our databases. Fast forward a couple of years now to 2014, there was a massive change that happened, actually thanks to a lawsuit where this man named Carl Malamute actually said that we should actually have machine-readable data. This is ridiculous that we're, dealing in image files. And as recently as 2016, the IRS actually started releasing in machine-readable format, which is a huge improvement. your tax returns up to the Amazon Web Services cloud. And so we no longer have to extract information off of an image file that could be handwritten, but now it's actually in machine readable. So it's very easily digestible information. But we're getting probably about half of those. I think 2016 we had about 2015 we had about 52,000 IRS documents that came to us directly from the IRS in machine readable format of 86,000. So that's a big improvement. But again, a lot of foundations don't necessarily realize that that information that they're putting in as their compliance document turns into rich tools like this. And so the other issue with this tax return form format is that, even on a good day when a foundation, submits the data like 3 months after their fiscal year closes, it still takes the IRS like 3 months to process the information and then to load it and then time for us to get it. So, on a good day, we're still at least a year behind in terms of the information. And again, because foundations aren't necessarily intentionally sharing this with the idea of it becoming the research for the field, oftentimes there's a lot of missed opportunity for detail and nuance. So back in 1996, the Foundation Center started a program called the Electronic Reporting Program, because we're called on by all the actors in the field, whether it's questions about where is the giving going to a region or to an issue, or what types of support strategies and what's going towards social justice movements, or even commenting on sort of the latest news. All those questions end up coming to us because we're the centralizing force for all of that philanthropic data. And so we started a program to encourage foundations to report directly to us, and that program was all about sort of educating all of you about what are the questions that we know come up in the field, and how can you share information that can help us all answer those questions to be more strategic and more collaborative, and to be able to sort of have a more strategic orientation in general. And so this program started in 1996. It had a slow growth until we started a partnership with the United Philanthropy Forum, working through 28 regional associations to try and both educate and encourage by creating a real value proposition for you to share your data as much as possible with Foundation Center, and in exchange, you would get access to the regional giving maps that are for each one of your regions that would show you how that data translates into a useful tool. And so that was sort of the latest evolution, which precedes the dashboard. We've been working on this Get on the Map campaign for a couple of years now, trying to beef up that information infrastructure to create the data source, not just from, obviously there's a huge rich repository that we're getting from the IRS documents, but where it concerns giving data and where it concerns kind of really describing the intentionality of that grant making, we're trying to encourage foundations as much as possible to share data directly with us with the electronic reporting program. And so just to give you an idea so that you understand this dashboard, these are the head counts from 2015 to 2017, and this really does make the case for why we need to self-report as much as possible. In 2015, Pennsylvania was home to 6,500 foundations. In 2016, we've got data for 5,900. And then when we get into 2017, we only have 1,900 foundations for whom we have data at this point, just because that's the general lag in the information flow that's sort of structural. And the only way to bypass that is to get foundations to submit data directly to Foundation Center. So I'm going to show you how to do that a little bit later on, but I think that that's an important framing for you to understand the data that you're going to see in the dashboard, because this is sort of the exciting transition that we're trying to make. And I actually want to applaud the Pennsylvania Grantmaker associations that have underwritten this work, because they have taken a very bold step. Usually when we do research, we're always like, we've got to get the most reliable and most accurate set, and the most accurate set is often 2 years old, because that's the most comprehensive data set we have. And in this case, the dashboard is just going to show you here's what we have so far for 2017. And if it doesn't look right, it's because we don't have access to the data, and it's on you to submit it to us. So let me just pause for a second, because I'm going to switch over to the dashboard here, and I just want to make sure, are there any questions that people have relating to this first part, the framing? Okay, then I actually would like to just quickly ask you a question about how familiar you are with Get on the Map, because I know that we're talking through 3 regions, and I've got a couple responses here. It looks like many of you have never heard about it, so this is actually very important for us to know moving forward, because we'll be sure to reach out to everyone with some information about what Get on the Map is and how Get on the Map is sort of the building block for what we're releasing today, because the vision was always that we would sort of build up that information infrastructure, and then we would visualize that data in useful ways for all of your members. So I'm going to give everyone like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We've got about 20 responses. Let's see if we can get a couple more people in here. We're almost halfway there in terms of everyone responding. I'm kind of loving the couple of responses that I'm seeing here, that several of you actually really use the map all the time. And for those of you who don't know about it, you can have multiple answers. Are you interested in knowing more about it? Is it something that we can reach out to you directly with some information? Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. It looks like we still have our work cut out for us, and hopefully this dashboard will really give you the motivation to start to contribute data to to the dashboard and to the map. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to introduce you, drum roll, to the dashboard. Okay. So right here is the Pennsylvania Foundation Stats, aka the dashboard. The reason why we're calling it the dashboard is that what's important to know about this information is that this is based on the most recently available information, and that information is updated weekly. So one day to the next, you may come and look for numbers, and it'll, if it's over a weekend, we'll probably have updated with more information. So it's sort of a real truth serum in terms of what's available in terms of information. So when I come into the dashboard here, I just want to walk you through the layout so you sort of understand what are all the levers and how it's sort of intended to be used here. So across the top, you'll notice there is an About page. If any of you feel like you're going to want to use some of this information to cite it or anything, I encourage you all to take a look through the About section that kind of explains the sources of data for each of the sections, so that you're very accurate in about how you cite the information. And then you'll come across the top scroll bar here, and you'll see that there is 2017, 2016, 2015, 2014, and 2013. And those are the 5 years of data that we're making available. For each one of these more recent years, you'll notice that a little icon pops up and says, you know, data is still being collected, and there's ways in which you can help to support that. And when we get to 2017, that's where information kind of really falls off because we just don't have access to it. And then across the top here, we have, across the region, we have all of Pennsylvania, Allegheny County. And then for Northeastern Pennsylvania, it'll show you here the counties that are included in Northeastern Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia area, and then Western Pennsylvania. And again, it'll list off all the counties that are counted in there. And so you can switch back and forth between sort of all of Pennsylvania and Northeastern Pennsylvania at any point in keeping the years consistent, as well as where you are in the tabs. And then when you come down here, if let's say we go back to all of Pennsylvania and we go to 2015, what you'll see here is there's 4 tabs across the top. The first one is sort of the overview information. The second one is giving priorities. The third one is giving to Pennsylvania by non-Pennsylvania foundations, and that'll change depending on which region you're in. It's really just kind of giving from out of region in region, and as well as giving to Pennsylvania. So let me just walk you through this kind of fast, but because there's a lot of details here. So when you look at the overview tab, the first thing you'll see is it'll give you the latest head count, and this is really information that is taken directly from 990s unless it's been updated with us. So, you know, the number of foundations, total giving, and total assets for that given year. And then as you scroll down here, you'll see that you can see the top 25 foundations by assets and then also by giving. And you can see a breakdown of the type of foundations. And in Pennsylvania, you have opted to include health legacy foundations, but if you wanted to, for instance, take those out, you can remove them and see the distribution of community to family, or you can take operating out of there as well. So you can opt to sort of see any piece of this. And if you just hover over any portion of the bar, it'll tell you what the numbers are associated with that. And obviously, it's kind of hard to keep track of all those numbers, and you don't need to necessarily be scrambling to write all this down if you were actually trying to cite this. You can always come up here and download the data in Excel. So this just sort of helps you to visualize it and make meaning out of it. Similarly, you can walk through the last 10 years of data and look at the percentage change in numbers and assets and giving over the last 10 years. If you go up to 2017, it'll go, for instance, if you pop over here to 2017, you'll see that the information comes in and it sort of drops off. Again, that's where we need to improve the currency of the information. And then you can see the distribution by asset ranges, the number of foundations. So 523 foundations, you know, have assets between 1 and 5 million. And also the giving by giving range as well. Then when you come across the top here and you click over to the giving priorities, one of the things you'll notice here is we'll go back to 2015 because that's probably the more current year in terms of comprehensiveness of data. The first thing you'll see here is a quick snapshot, you know, that there were 4,772 Pennsylvania foundations that awarded 67,728 grants totaling $20 billion in 2018. Now, what you'll notice here is that there's this little bubble that says the available grants data represents about 81% of total giving. So this goes back to that total giving number here that we have 2.5 billion. And that becomes sort of the denominator for that. So we know that there's going to be 33.2 billion, and so we have available grants data for about 81% of that. What you'll notice here is when you get up into like 2017, if you see like 100%, that's actually because the denominator in 2017, we just don't have the total giving number accurately reflected. So it's a little bit harder to track what percentage of the grants data that we have. But in this case, you know, I feel a little bit more confident in the older data to say we know that 81% of total giving is reflected in this information. And so you go through the top sort of 10, this is based on the Philanthropy classification system, which is the system the Foundation Center uses to organize all the data. And we have subject codes, sort of a parent top 11 subject areas, as well as many drill downs that we do. But this is just sort of reflecting the higher level, you know, arts, education, health, human rights. And for each one of these, you can see who the top 10 funders are in that issue area. And you can compare it to what's interesting is you can compare, so you can be in all of Pennsylvania, and you could just compare the Philadelphia funders, for instance, and just click over here and see who the top health funders in Philadelphia are. Again, remembering that if you're sort of finding it hard to navigate here, you can also pull it down into an Excel spreadsheet and look at that information as well. Then you can come down here through population focus, looking at the grants data that in terms of who were the intended beneficiaries, immigrants and refugees, or LGBTQ, and you can see the grants and the distribution. So a lot more of a focus on children and youth in Philadelphia, not as much on men and boys, et cetera. And you start to see that breakdown. Similarly, for support strategies, you can start to see that the majority of the money is going towards program development. Although what I'm seeing region to region is that there seems to be a growth in policy and advocacy and system reform, because I think that that's sort of an emphasis of being more strategic with limited dollars. So that's something that's sort of come up because there's 5 other regions that have actually launched dashboards, and when you look at growth over time, that's something that's starting to become an interesting sort of growth pattern that we're seeing. And then this is how the money is being distributed within the Philadelphia area. We'll go back up, let me just pop up to Pennsylvania here, all of Pennsylvania. And you can see that the majority of the money is actually staying within Pennsylvania. Some of it is going out of Pennsylvania, and very little of it is actually going to international organizations. Okay. So now the third tab of information here is the money that's coming in from out of region. So in this case, we have it set to Pennsylvania. It could be set to northern Pennsylvania or western Pennsylvania. And you'll see that there's a large number of foundations. And this is actually one of the more enlightening things, I think, that especially in regions that don't often, like I live in Oregon, for instance, and we have this issue with, the 5 funders in Oregon that are always being tapped for support because they sort of are the largest funders in Oregon. And when you show them this or some of the other tools that we have, that there's, thousands of funders that are funding in Oregon, thousands. Well, in this case, in Pennsylvania, there's over 6,000 funders that have awarded in 2015 over 48,000 grants. Now this is just the top 25 here, and there are tools, and both Barb and Kurt, and I guess Kurt can tell you a little bit more also about the Funding Information Network. But there are ways in which to find all of those 48,000 grants and the 6,600 funders. And then overall giving here is looking at the distribution of the top 25 recipients in Pennsylvania, as well as the giving to Pennsylvania recipients versus non-Pennsylvania, from Pennsylvania and non-Pennsylvania foundations. So when we look at Pennsylvania, the majority of the recipients the majority of foundations that are funding in Pennsylvania are actually from Pennsylvania, although there is quite a hefty number of foundations that are not. When you compare it, for instance, I was just looking at this a little bit earlier, so the Northeastern region has a predominance of non-Northeastern foundations that are funding the Northeastern region, as an example of how that's different. So that's just a quick overview here of the dashboard and the ability to kind of go between them. I'll give you a sense of what the dashboard Excel download ends up looking like. So this is sort of the top 25 foundations, and it'll show you the assets and then the giving, percentage change over time. So each one of those charts turns into its own tab in an Excel sheet, so you're able to kind of pull that information down and compare it region to region. Depending on, it'll download the data for the page that's loaded. And so hopefully that will be helpful to you. And I'm going to switch back out of the demo here, but are there any questions before I do?
Davis, this is Jenny. I'm not sure if this is true for everyone, but the spreadsheet that you just showed didn't show up for me. It was just a gray screen.
Oh, see, thank you for pointing that out. I will, it's because I shared only an application. I thought I was sharing my desktop. So let me just Thank you for catching that. I'll just share my desktop and then we can, no, actually I'll just share. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you all can see, it's a very simple download across the top. So this is that Foundations Overview tab, the first one that I showed you. So you have a summary that gives you a breakdown of over the years, as well as the top 25 foundations by assets, the top 25 foundations by total giving, by type of foundation, percentage change in the number, change in assets, and then basically kind of goes on. So each one of those charts is visualized, that's visualized has its own tab where the data behind it kind of comes down. Okay, any other questions?
David, there is one question. Are you able to see the questions as they come in, or do you need me to feed them to you?
I am. I'm able to see the questions, although if there was a flurry, I hope you'll help me with them. But I think I can handle this. It looks like Catalina says, is Get on the Map intended to complement the Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania reporting tool? I'm going to try and answer that. I'm going to try and answer what I think is the question there. And Catalina, you can feel free to correct me if I am not getting it right. So the vision here is that all the data behind the dashboard that I just showed you is either pulled from tax return forms or it's pulled from the self-reporting of foundations who contribute data directly to Foundation Center. And we can't get from the IRS more recent stuff than what you see there in 2017. The only way we can get into really current information is if foundations submit directly to us, because there's just no way. And so the vision of these two programs between Get on the Map and the dashboard is that you submit one time and your data goes into the dashboard. It goes into the Get on the Map map that's part of your information. And then for that matter, if, for instance, you're supporting water issues, your data will be coded for water and it'll go to the Water Access, Sanitation, and Hygiene portal, or it'll go to democracy funders if you're doing democracy work. And so because of the coding and the structuring of the data behind it, your data will pipeline into all the conversations where they're relevant. And so the idea is to kind of create this very efficient system where you submit it once and then you can see it supporting all this work that's informing philanthropy. So it looks like Valerie had a question about, are you able to get information on more than 20 top givers? The answer is not on the dashboard. You can look at the list on the dashboard. There are tools, both there's Foundation Maps, which is sort of a tool that visualizes and maps all the giving, as well as Foundation Directory Online, which are also tools for predominantly more for grant seekers on how to visualize and kind of get under the hood of all this data. And both of those tools are professional level subscription tools, but they're available at over 450 locations around the country, one of which is Kurt's house called in Northeastern Pennsylvania. And I can share a link for the rest of you at the locations around all of Pennsylvania where you can access those tools to get under the hood and get more. Okay, so let me pause. I'll take that last question at the end because I want to make sure that we have enough time because there's a couple more things to do here. Okay, so what you can do to make this better. I think there's been a, yay, this is really exciting. This is groundbreaking, actually. I mean, we just haven't gotten into, regularly updating data. We're always sort of doing a survey and publishing the results of the survey, which is pretty much outdated by the time it gets there. So this is the most current, this is the most comprehensive data set on philanthropy in Pennsylvania, broken down in hopefully really useful ways for you all to start to make meaning out of it. Obviously, the memo here is share as much data as possible directly with us. The Foundation Center has a program, has a tool called Updater, which allows you to both publish your fiscal data, your program data, your publications if you want to, as well as your grant making data. And you can send it directly to us. We have a couple of tips in terms of how you should share data with us. One of the things that we run into a lot is that people send us a lot of notes, like internal scratch notes. So everything you send us, assume that it will be published. We will omit certain pieces of information, but I think just having that lens towards this is public information that we're trying to create and serving the public good. So if you make grants to individuals, protect all personal information, avoid acronyms and foundation speak, a lot of internal talk that doesn't mean as much to the broader audience. If you're sending us grant details, make sure we know whether or not these are authorized amounts or paid amounts, because that we try to keep track and distinguish that. And then the most important thing is in sharing, and this actually I will say goes to both your grant description that you might share with us or what you might put on your Form 990, is grant descriptions are kind of key to us trying to capture the intentionality of the giving. So even if it's your purpose of giving statement on your Form 990, I have a couple of tips that I want to share with you about that. So to share your information, you can just go to updater@foundationcenter.org, and you'll see that you can share a whole host of details here, from basic information, fiscal information, application, your people, your reports, etc., as well as upload your grants to share with us. We have a template. We'll make sure to follow up after this and share with you the template that sort of helps to organize the details that we're trying to collect. It really doesn't have to be that complicated. I mean, you have to pull together for the IRS at least that basic, name of recipient, city, state, a purpose of the grant statement, fiscal year, and the amount. So at the very least, if you could send that to us, that's great. And if you can send it to us before you submit your 990s, that's even better, because that means we can get into real-time data. Right now, we're sort of getting closer to reasonable time data. And then if you want to add any other details, like if you code your grants or you are very specific about the geographic area served or the beneficiary population, we welcome that level of detail. In terms of a grant description, just very quickly here, one of the things we run into, because tax return forms often have grant descriptions that say for the library project or something equally, as unhelpful in terms of understanding what the intentionality of the grant making was. And so when thinking about what a good grant description looks like, if you can include information about what was the primary objective of the grant, how will the objectives of the grant be served, right? Who are the groups that are meant to be, and by how, the how piece is this a program support grant? Is this a capacity building grant? Is this a policy and systems reform grant, et cetera? If there's any beneficiaries, women and girls, specific religions, whatever the beneficiary population is, if you can include that, as well as if there's any geographies that are being served beyond the recipient. So examples are, you have a lot of DC nonprofits that serve overseas. But right now, if we're just limited to IRS data, it looks like, DC is just getting this flood of money, but it's actually going to other places around the world. And in a grant description, if you are clear about that, then our auto-coding systems will pick up those keywords and will actually code to say, no, this is not a grant for Washington, D.C., this is a grant for Tanzania, and it's based on the grant description. So it doesn't have to be super long. You can literally say, a reading program for women coming out of prison, that aims to avoid recidivism, serving in Harlow County, period. That's all it has to be. But if you have all those elements reflected in there, then you'll see a lot of that, those indexes that I showed you, those support strategies, those will all become even more accurate. So I want to point you to, just as a great blog that was written by a colleague, Gretchen Shackle. She's a grants manager at the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation. And she actually went through this exercise of showing how she went through improving her grant descriptions. And that's kind of key at this point to capturing this. As much as we'd love for everyone to code their data using the foundation's philanthropy classification system, if we could just kind of move towards a more complete grant description, then we would be so much better served by this work. So I think that's just the quick and dirty here. We'll share around this slide deck, and when you get to the slide deck, there's the blog URL to get to the series, but then there's also, you can click on the image of this and it'll take you there. So I think that ends my demonstration part as well as my call to action, and I'm going to turn it over to Barb, I think, to talk a little bit, and Barb and Sydney to talk a little bit about how they sort of envision this tool being used in your various regions.
Great. Thank you very much, Davis. I'm Barbara Seek-Taylor with Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania, and I've been really excited to get this dashboard up and running. One of the main reasons in terms of a use case that I think this is going to be so helpful is in communicating both the scale and the characteristics of philanthropy to policymakers and people in the public sector. There are a couple of levels of this, of course. Grantmakers and other peer associations take part once a year in a visit to Capitol Hill called Foundations on the Hill, where we all pay calls on our congressional delegations, and we try to educate lawmakers and their staffs on how philanthropy is serving the local community. Based on some years of experience with this, I can tell you that a lot of congressional staff have little to no grounding either in nonprofits, much less philanthropy, and so they don't understand the way those two communities work together. They don't understand how foundations work in particular, and they also, are often quite junior staff initially, but 3 years later, 5 years later, they're in positions of real responsibility. They're becoming legislative directors or chiefs of staff, and they're starting to have real influence on policy decisions that affect everyone, all kinds of exempt organizations. So a tool like this is going to be super helpful to be able to point people to give them good data on just how limited philanthropic dollars are and also where those dollars go. The messages that I wind up sharing with at the federal level and also with state and municipal officials mostly have to do with the perception that philanthropy is a lot bigger than it is. When people see philanthropy covered in the news and they're outside the field, they read about the Gates Foundation investing hundreds of millions of dollars in public school reform, which sounds great until you compare it to what the federal and state and local governments all spend on public education. The important message for them to hear is that philanthropic dollars are very competitive and that they cannot make up for cuts in public sector services. The numbers just don't add up. And so a tool like this makes that very obvious. Another kind of dimension of this is on those occasions when I'm asked or other people in similar organizations are asked to educate municipal officials. I've had a couple instances of being asked to be part of a training for borough and township officials in Pennsylvania who are trying to figure out how they can work with private philanthropy to make their municipalities better. And they need to understand, how many dollars there are out there, where those dollars come from, where those dollars are flowing, the degree to which they're flowing towards something like stormwater management as opposed to economic development, as opposed to pre-K services. And a tool like this is going to be, eventually, as the data comes in, a tool like this is going to be incredibly helpful for those people in seeing where the trends are flowing and who is, in the case of the largest foundations, who's potentially someone who could invest in their community. The last thing I would say is that this tool, I think, also will help us make the case at the federal level to help protect the incentives for charitable giving. While the number of dollars that foundations give pales in comparison to what the public sector spends, those dollars are nonetheless extremely important, as everybody on this call knows, because they are flexible and they can be used to support something more innovative or potentially riskier than what the public sector will support. So, the point I'll end with is it will help everyone in the public sector to have a better understanding of how big or how small private philanthropy is, foundation philanthropy is, and we hope it'll help make the case for policy decisions that encourage more giving, and both by individuals and by the foundation sector. So I'll hand it off to Sydney at this point, I believe.
Sure. Thank you, Barb. And I'll just add a few. I think we've actually had examples of uses as recently as the last month or so, and so I'll just give some of those examples where it came up in conversation. The first example is when you take a look at the Philadelphia Area Foundation's overview, the opportunity to look at subsector information and to categorize it by corporate and private, et cetera. We've had a number of calls recently that was basically asking the same question, and that is, do we know of and or anticipate an increase in corporate funding due to the tax law that was implemented this year? And obviously, we all know that it's too early to tell, but we can speak. This particular dashboard gave us the opportunity to speak in greater detail about corporate giving specifically and over the years. And so the opportunity to answer that type of question a year and a half to 2 years from now, when we actually know, we'll start to hopefully over time see that trend of to what degree it's had an impact. The other example is under, as we look under the non-Philadelphia area foundations, just the opportunity to really, as a region, and certainly a number of members and others in the area have been, other leaders in the area have been having conversations about, like, how do we increase national funding investment into our region. And that conversation usually starts with the question of, like, do we even know what it looks like now? So the opportunity to really dig a little deeper here and at least get some idea, even though it's not, it's not all foundations giving in this area, but it's a significant number, at least gives us a feel for what it could look like now. For example, you find it interesting that in our area, the number 2 foundation outside the area is the Silicon Area Community Foundation, which basically translates to donor advised funds out of the area into the area, and that's an interesting note to realize the impact of donor advised funds coming into our area. The third area is to be able to look at the foundation giving priorities, as it was mentioned earlier. And this is particularly of interest for our affinity groups that, those groups like the arts funders, et cetera, who want to know more collectively about arts funding in the area, et cetera. And then the final one for me is really more aspirational, is when you really look at the total assets of regional foundations, the top regional foundations, and the giving of those same foundations. You can start to ask questions about, if it's at $15 billion and it's been that way, for the plus or minus for the last couple of years, and those are, that's the assets. So what does it look like to say something like, what would happen if we could take, outside of the grant making, an additional mission-aligned investment of an additional 1% of that into the region? And, what does it look like if you could actually have that conversation and talk about what $150 million in investment from Corpus would look like in our region? And so you can start with that baseline data and then start to think about what if as well. And that will be it. That's it for me.
Thank you, Sydney. So I think
before we switch to questions really quickly,
sure.
I see that there's a couple of questions that have come up about kind of how do you get access to more details, kind of how do you get underneath the hood of this? And so I just wanted to quickly share my screen and show you the locations around Pennsylvania here. And you can go to GrantSpace. You'll notice across the top it's grantspace.org. And when you're here, just very easily, you just type in Pennsylvania, and it will show you the funding network locations. There's a bunch of tools that can help you kind of get underneath the hood for the individual users who really want to take this synopsis and this summary and this visualization and these distributions and start to look at the details of those individual foundations. I encourage you to start there. Just pop into one of these locations. Part of the you might even find Kurt at the Nonprofit Community Assistance Program, but here there's all the hours that are Community Assistance Center, sorry. There's the hours, the details, and there's somebody there who can actually help answer those questions for you, as well as help you navigate some of the tools that'll get you under the hood of the dashboard. Okay, so with that, I just wanted to pause and let us go now to questions. And I'll take that first question, Jenny, because I know that one was directed specifically at me, which is, does the map come with contact information for the foundations that are on the map? And the answer is on the regional maps and in tools that you'll find at the Funding Information Center, there's all the contact information you could need, as well as any details about how a foundation wants to be approached that we have been able to gather. And some of them say specifically, we don't take unsolicited applications, in which case that's a good indicator that they're not looking to be approached, or that they might be part of a network that you could unearth. But and I guess Andrea asked a second question, which is, do foundations update their information annually? So in an ideal world, yes. At the very least, they have to, in order to stay in compliance with the IRS, they have to submit a tax return form every year. And that information continues to update annually. But if a foundation reports directly to us, they can report as often as as often as monthly. I don't know why you do that, but we'd love it if you did. You could do quarterly if you want. You can follow your grant making cycle and send information to us after that if that is convenient for you. A lot of grants managers will do that, which is once the the letters have been sent, they'll publish a list and send it directly to us and just kind of keep that going on that schedule. And then many of the grants management systems that you all use actually have easy exports to send data directly to us as well. So, let's see. I'll just keep taking these questions because I think they're really all directed at me.
Yeah.
So Michael asked whether you accept data from regranters. The answer is yes. We do our best whenever we do research to try and deduplicate. Unfortunately, that is kind of an issue. And what for those of you that might not totally get the question, so you've got a private foundation that might support a United Way, which gives grants to local communities. And so you'll get that double counting the grant that went from, Ford to the United Way and then United Way to the end. And that is just sort of an area that when we have extra time and, we're sort of contracted to do that extra work, we'll dedupe that data. Or we oftentimes, if you take out grant-making public charities, you can avoid that in terms of the visualization. But for the general data set, that duplication work is in there. And so it's just important to kind of be aware of that. But we do accept it because obviously the end users of the money is really where it's important in terms of understanding where the grant dollars are going. And then Brian asks, is it valuable to submit grant info with a grant description to keep donor info confidential? I'm not totally sure I understand that question, but I think I'm understanding it is if you want to keep the donor info confidential, we're trying to move towards transparency as much as possible. And so the baseline of transparency at this point is what you're required to submit to the IRS, because that's kind of there's a hard line. The IRS says you've got to be transparent about that. Now, sometimes like corporate giving programs, for instance, that are not beholden to that level of transparency, that's really hard data to get. And so a lot of times they'll have very competitive reasons why they want to keep the donor information private, and so they'll send us the grant details but not want the donor information published, and we'll do that. But if they're a private foundation, we don't want to go further backwards in transparency. So you can send us information if you're interested in sending us information where the donor would be held private. Just send me an email after this, and I can help you kind of work through the details of that. It is possible, though we kind of don't love it, but we got to do it because it's kind of the way the journey towards transparency requires small steps. So, any other questions? My oh my, we are finishing on time, on the nose. So Jenny, I'll let you close us out then. Thanks everyone for my part.
Thank you, Davis. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Barb and Sydney and Kurt. Thank you all for joining us and all the participants. As Davis mentioned, we will be following up. We'll send you the slide deck and information about how to access the tool and access to the recording of this webinar if you missed any portion of it or if you'd like to share it with anyone. So be on the lookout for that email from us. And I think that wraps us up today. So thanks, everyone.
Congratulations, you all.
Thank you.